I'm so happy to be here with you all today and our inspiring panelists to talk about the power of women and sustainability. I'm really excited about the topic of this panel because this is something I'm personally so passionate about. And I would just love to jump right in. So I will go ahead and introduce our amazing speakers. Leah Thomas, you can come right up. Leah is a celebrated environmentalist and the founder of the nonprofit Intersectional Environmentalist, which aims to advocate for environmental justice and has become a leading advocate and resource for diverse and accessible environmental education. She is also the author of the Intersectional Environmentalist, How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. Next, I will welcome Sophia Kianni. Sophia is an Iranian-American activist and the executive director of Climate Cardinals, an international nonprofit with 9,000 volunteers in over 40 countries working to translate climate information into over 100 languages. She is also the youngest person to ever serve as a United Nations advisor and is currently studying at Stanford University. And finally, I will welcome Phoebe Gates. Woo! Phoebe is a women's health and reproductive rights advocate and a student at Stanford University. She has a deep passion for gender equality, women's health, and sustainable fashion, and is driven to use her voice, platform, and work to harness meaningful change. She has also worked with British Vogue and Stella McCartney's team to deepen her knowledge of the fashion industry, informing her drive towards sustainable fashion accessibility. Ladies, thank you all so much for being here today. I wanted to ask this first question to each of you. Women and girls are not only at the front lines of the climate crisis, but we're also the most equipped to lead the world into a better future. However, we still see a severe lack of underrepresentation within governments, finance, executive leadership of environmental nonprofits, climate negotiations, and other positions of power. In 2023, our government still does not look like or represent the population that they serve. The changes we need to see within representation and power dynamics, especially in governments, are not happening fast enough to meet the scale and timeline of the climate crisis. So I wanted to ask, how do we bring more feminine leadership into positions of power, and how do we do it fast?
Thank you, Summer. That was such a great question. That's also really complicated because unfortunately, there are a lot of women and women of color, not unfortunately, I'm happy about that, but that are working in sustainability. But it's a problem because a lot of, I don't want to say men, have destroyed the earth and are in a lot of positions of power, and women are there and kind of expected to clean it all up. And this is something that's called ecofeminism, which makes the argument that in a society that exploits the earth, that society is often going to exploit women. And that's something that we see in the United States and various countries around the world. So we do actually see more women that are working in sustainability fields. And I think that's amazing, but there's not often women in the highest positions of power. And that's something that needs to change because it's all of our responsibility. And I'm so happy that women have been a part of this field for a really long time, but it isn't just our responsibility to nurture the earth back to health. So yeah, some nuance there.
Amazing, thank you.
I think it's important to recognize that when you look at the stats, it shows that 80% of the people that are being impacted by climate change, 80% of climate refugees are actually women. And yet when you look at the field of environmental science, 2/3 of environmental scientists are men and only 1/3 are women. And when you're talking about an issue where women are being disproportionately impacted, we also should be adequately represented at decision-making tables. And when you look at some of the leading voices in the climate movement over the last few years, it's women like Lawrence Tubina, Mary Robinson, Christina Figueres, who have played a leading role in negotiating agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement that have been pivotal to really the success of the climate movement. So ensuring that women see themselves represented, ensuring that they get access to equal pay, and that they feel empowered to take these leadership roles is the way that we ensure that young women like us, it's hard to be something that you can't see. And so for us to see these women in these in these positions of leadership helps us to see that we also can do that. And so that we're adequately prepped with the education, with the tools to take on these additional responsibilities.
Yeah, well, first of all, so excited to be here with these women. I think that this is a really interesting question because it kind of transcends all industries beyond the climate movement. And the real question is, how do we put women in the room where it's happened, when we're making decisions about, our futures? I think too often decisions about our futures, our lives, and our bodies are made for women and not by women. And so, when you look across all industries, like even the Fortune 500 CEOs, only 41 of those are women. And when you give women the option to choose to fight for their rights, like we saw in Kansas and Wisconsin, they will show up and they will flip the ballot. I mean, we saw in Michigan in 2018 that women flipped that midterm election and actually infused the right in the state constitution for a right to abortion. So it's really about, how do we give women access to capital? How do we fund their businesses? How do we show up? And how do we put them in positions of power where other young women can see them as tools of inspiration, and get those women in the room where it happens?
Amazing. Thank you. Sophia, I really resonated with that point about that stat about men in environmental science, because I studied environmental science in college. And I often felt like I was one of the only women and the only woman of color studying in my field. So representation is really huge. My next question leading into that, I wanted to ask Leah. Leah, you and your team have built something so incredible with Intersectional Environmentalist, and it's just been so fun, like watching it grow into what it is today. So props to that. And I also just wanted to ask you, you recently co-hosted a Black Ecofeminist Summit in London. It was described as a safe space built for Black women by Black women, which amplified the voices of Black environmentalists from the UK, US, and African and Caribbean diasporas. First off, I just want to say I love this idea so much. I think what's often missing from the dominant forces in environmentalism are spaces for joy and radical imagination. So I think this is really something so incredible and revolutionary. And I wanted to ask, how can we continue to create these safe spaces for Black women in environmentalism and hopefully inspire more Black women to take up space in sustainability?
Thank you for this question. I think a really big thing for me, because I studied environmental science and policy as well at a predominantly white institution, and I was the only Black woman in my class. But then I was lucky enough to talk to Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, and he said, just because they're not in your classroom doesn't mean we're not out there, girl, like get it together. And that was a really big wake-up call to me, because I realized like Black and brown folks have been out there doing sustainable things, not calling it sustainability for a really long time. Even my grandmother, the way that she gardens is dang near organic, or, saving her butter containers and her plastic bags. And I started thinking about the joy that I felt realizing that my ancestors are also sustainable. And even if they're not calling it that, we're out here. So I wanted to start creating spaces about environmentalism for those specific groups of people that were culturally competent, and we could say, this is how we do sustainability, and it not to just center around the trauma of environmental injustice. Because oftentimes when it comes to diversity and sustainability, people go right to the trauma of environmental injustice. But we're missing a lot when we're also not providing spaces to share the beautiful stories of Black and brown folks and their positive contributions to the sustainability movement, so they also feel empowered to take up space and again know that their ancestors were also activists. So I've been on a journey to create these sort of safe spaces and hyper niche communities for people to feel seen and heard and validated in the sustainability space, and to know that their environmental story doesn't just revolve around trauma. and that we can world build together and create community that's positive and start creating the futures we want to see that are greener, more regenerative, and equitable for all people on the planet.
So beautiful. Thank you. Sophia, I have a related question. I was watching one of your recent United Nations speeches about how you birth from your mom, and I resonated with that so much because I also really got my connection to the earth from my mom, and I inspired a lot of my family. And I don't think it's a coincidence to care from the earth from the women around us. So I wanted to ask, can you speak to this a little bit more and maybe talk about why you think feminine leadership in the climate movement is so powerful, especially when it comes to things like collaboration and implementing solutions?
Absolutely. When you look at the climate movement today, it's young women like Greta, Vanessa Nakate, Shea Bastida, some of my wonderful friends, and they are all young women, and it's no accident. And it's because research has actually shown that young women tend to be the most effective communicators of the climate crisis in terms of actually converting people and being able to make people understand the urgency with which we need to tackle this issue. And considering that, when I shared my personal story at the UN, I talked about the fact that growing up, my parents are both from Iran. Growing up, I would visit Iran with my mom and my sister. And when I was there, I was struck by how awful the air pollution was. I learned that climate change was disproportionately impacting the Middle East, with temperatures there rising more than twice the global average. And my relatives knew almost nothing about it. And so I worked with my mom to translate climate resources into Farsi so that I could teach my relatives about climate change. And that experience of working with her was actually what inspired me to engage in environmentalism, to start working with various grassroots groups until I eventually started my own nonprofit, Climate Cardinals, in my senior year of high school. And so this idea of women tend to be more collaborative than men. We tend to lead with empathy, compassion. And like I was saying before about these women like Mary Robinson, like Christina Figueres, they were instrumental in negotiating these agreements like the Paris Agreement. And so as we see this new really emergence of young women in the climate movement, these amazing young women that I just mentioned, and of course the amazing young women on this stage, I do think it's pivotal to acknowledge the values of collaboration and empathy with which we lead, that I think will be instrumental in actually coordinating long-term climate action and success.
Amazing, thank you. And my next question is for Phoebe. Phoebe, you are passionate about reproductive rights and women's health, not only for women in the US, but for women around the world. How and why did you get involved in women's reproductive health? And can you maybe talk about some of the intersections that you've seen in your experience between women's reproductive health and the climate crisis?
Yeah, totally. Well, I hate to be a broken record here, but again, a lot of my inspiration comes from my mother. Seeing her kind of career journey in the reproductive health space, when she realized, what women really need is access to birth control. This changes everything. It changes your future, your career's prospects, anything you can do. And I think across all these issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's racial justice, the real issue that we're talking about here is control. I mean, Gen Z were born into a situation where, we have this climate crisis that we didn't create, and we don't have the control to change it. We're dealing with out-of-touch lawmakers who aren't concerned with our future. When it comes to, being pro-choice, when it comes to reproductive justice, we're talking about the most innate form of control, which is having decisions about how to form our own family, about our own sex lives, about our own access to birth control. So I think a catalyzing theme for me was definitely, my mom's journey, and then just this theme of control that I think about, of how do we take back control and actually create the narrative of our own future for ourselves. And the Dobbs decision for me really catalyzed that, because that was the largest grab of power and control out of our hands that I could imagine on a national level, where the US is now moving backwards. And I thought, how the heck am I going to use my platform to talk about this, to bring that control back, to really shine the spotlight on these groups who are actually doing the work, the people who aren't in the classroom, who are on the ground. And so that's what I think about as the overarching theme of control in these different policies and issues.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great point. I also think when we think about control, a lot of the times when it comes to like climate anxiety and climate doom, it's that feeling of a lack of control. So I think taking that back is really important. I would love to finish things off with some hope and optimism as we continue on into the weekend. So I would love to ask each of you, what are some of the biggest opportunities to integrate sustainability into our daily lives that you are the most excited about?
I would say supporting local is so important. So supporting your local farmers, supporting local artisans. If you have a friend in your neighborhood who's like making tie-dye t-shirts or upcycling things from the thrift store, please support them. That's incredibly important. Creating resilient local economies. It's so great. And in addition to that, also supporting the local grassroots environmental justice groups in your area. Whenever I move to a new town, and I move like way too much, I don't know if that's sustainable, but I just want to live all over California. In every city, I'll go Ventura, Environmental Justice Group, Santa Barbara, Environmental Justice Group. Getting connected with those folks, even if all you can do is sharing their stuff on social media, donating $5 a month, etc. That's another way to really support your local economy and just your local community. And I think it's really important to know that we are the bearers of our own solutions, and there are environmental justice groups that have the solutions to some of the really big problems that we face, but they just need amplification and support and funding. So that keeps me really optimistic when I go, oh my God, there are people out there that have the solutions to these scary problems that we're facing, and we just have to join in and help them and support. And we have a shot at a really beautiful future. And if we look around us, there's people that are doing amazingly beautiful things in the present as well.
Like you three.
The number one thing I always tell people when they ask me how they can get involved in the fight for climate change is go vote. And that's because I think it's very important to look at the climate crisis as a systemic issue, especially when you consider stats like 100 companies are responsible for 71% of the world's industrial emissions, just 100 companies. It's going to be critical that we pass comprehensive climate legislation that actually holds oil and gas companies responsible for the disproportionate amount of blame that they really hold for causing the harm that we see on our planet. And then on a more personal level, I think the issue of fast fashion is a tremendous issue specifically for Gen Z, specifically for Gen Z women, because there's this paradox where young people are the most likely to say that they care about climate change and sustainability, but we also are the most likely to purchase fast fashion, to post these Shein hauls on TikTok. And so coming up with ways to make the sustainable fashion movement more accessible, to champion things like buying secondhand. I buy almost everything off of Vestiaire and Depop and Mercari now. And so promoting that as a solution to young people, making the climate movement more accessible is something that has really been a core facet and driving tenet of my activism.
Amazing.
Yeah, just to build on what Sophia is saying, I think voting is the only way we can actually get control back and make long-term change for our children. But I feel really passionate about the fashion issue as well, which is why I want to leverage, technology, and what I'm working on now with Sophia is a way to kind of bring this segmented market where sustainable clothing just isn't, you can't access it. The general consumer can't access it. You spend hours on these secondhand sites. The sustainable brands are way too expensive. So how do we make it easy to access this solution? Because right now our incentives of wanting to spend little money and being sustainable, frankly, aren't aligned. So I'm really excited about leveraging technology to make the secondhand industry super accessible.
Amazing. That's incredible. I'm so excited to hear more about that. All right. Well, thank you so much to these three incredible women. I get so much inspiration and hope from you three. And I would love to open it up to the audience. If you guys have any questions for these three, we have about 15 minutes or so. If you guys have any questions. Yes, ready?
What do you guys think is the solution for fast fashion? And when you talk about like spending less and not consuming fast fashion, what is that solution? Because even as a guy, I attend a lot of events and I gotta change up my attire, and it's kind of hard to to go online and to find things that are, you know, that are maybe secondhand?
Yeah, I can start. Well, the first thing I would say is Reformation has this great tagline that I love, which is being naked is the #1 most sustainable option, and we're #2. And I think that really speaks to the fact that we need to be pragmatic. People need to buy clothes sometimes. They need things to wear to their work conferences. They want things to wear to school. And promoting that narrative of conscious consumerism, of buying when you need to and investing in clothes that are going to last a long time is a communication and a message that I think is very important, because a lot of this is about unlearning a behavior and a narrative that has been perpetuated by the fast fashion industry, which is you need new clothes. You need to continue consuming this notion of conspicuous consumerism. And so promoting the idea of buy secondhand, invest in quality pieces is something that I am personally very passionate about, and a message I think really resonates with Gen Z. And so, like Phoebe was saying, I think tech, and given that we both come from Stanford, obviously we hear about tech, computer science, the power it has to change the world all the time. And I think that can specifically be applied when it comes to fashion in promoting solutions like shopping secondhand, like buying secondhand, because the emissions reduction in comparison to buying a new item is quite significant. And it also addresses that key pain point of the fact that young people don't have a lot of disposable income. That's why they're shopping fast fashion, because that's the only thing that they can really afford. And so making sure we're not saying, you know, go buy a $1,000 handbag because it's sustainable, but instead saying buy less. And when you do buy, think of it in a conscious way, and then also consider the idea of buying secondhand. Yes, you can definitely buy quality secondhand. And actually, my favorite places to look for quality secondhand would definitely be Vestiaire Collective. They actually have banned fast fashion brands from selling on their website. So you can't go and buy a Shein shirt secondhand on Vestiaire Collective. It's only really quality pieces that are gonna last a long time. So balancing those two dual narratives, I think, is very important.
Oh, thank you. That's okay. So thanks. It's really nice to see young women up here who are doing some fantastic things. I work for UNFCCC, which is the UN Climate Change Framework. And if you could have one thing you want us to push for with national legislation across the world, what would that be?
Yeah. Just one. I'm going to say climate reparations and wealth redistribution. I think we have a lot of organizations and activists that are doing incredible work, but they really just need the funding to scale. I am really excited right now in the US. There's pretty significant environmental justice policy for the first time, where there's over $100 million that's going specifically to environmental justice organizations. But thinking globally, there's going to be more climate refugees, a tremendous amount of displacement of people. So we need to talk about climate reparations, the folks that are the least responsible for the climate crisis, having the resources to be able to preserve their cultures, survive, relocate if necessary. So I would say climate reparations and wealth redistribution is something that has to happen.
Kind of to build on that, I think a historic outcome that came from COP27, which is the annual UN Climate Change Conference, was the first ever establishment of a loss and damage fund. And so making sure that that money actually materializes is the biggest thing that's on my mind. And I know a lot of other youth activists that I work with to ensure that there's follow through on these commitments.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a huge push for, forcing these smaller nations to be green. And we need to be realistic that, bigger nations like the US are the people who have created the majority of emissions. So how do we, promote these other nations being green, but actually doing it in a way where we allow them to industrialize as well? And we're not, putting undue burden on them from our mistakes, frankly, would be the biggest thing. Having their representation, having them in the room when you're creating these frameworks would be incredible.
Okay. Hi, thank you. Okay, yeah. Thank you guys so much. I was really interested in this talk because there's the intersection of health and sustainability, and I've worked in both of those spaces. And I'm a travel author, actually. So I've written a book about sustainable travel, which is its own thing. But my question is actually about communication. So how do you resonate and relate with communities that are disenfranchised or that are most impacted? And what kind of comes to mind for me is these communities often cannot do too much, and or in terms of even being able to contribute or get involved, they already have so many other things that they're dealing with or facing. So I'm just kind of curious about how you tailor that message to those communities and or partner with them.
This is such a great question. And I think Phoebe raised such a valid point, which is when we're communicating this issue, it is important to talk about the issue of privilege and also the narrative of who has caused the climate crisis, who is disproportionately responsible, and who is benefiting from it. And it is rich countries like the United States. And it is important to lead with that so that we aren't penalizing places like Africa, which is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions and yet is facing disproportionate harm from climate change. And I love the issue you raised about communication, because a big focus of my activism has been the fact I think that social media has really democratized access to social impact. Now you have a scenario where a young person can go on Twitter, they can go on TikTok, they can go on Instagram, and they can talk about an issue like climate change that they really care about, and people can be genuinely compelled. They are able to spread a message. And so playing into that narrative of every single person has the power and the potential to spread awareness, to champion a message they care about. I love to say that I believe every single person can be a climate activist, and we need many more imperfect climate activists than we do people who commit not to fly, who are fully vegan. We need people to take steps every single day to further their own environmental journeys so that together, really collaboration is going to be key.
Any other questions?
Perfect. Hi. What do you see the role of the private sector as in solving these problems, not just in terms of regulation or punitive measures, but in terms of collaboration to create shared value where we need them most for these problems?
Yeah, sure. I definitely think that there's need for regulation, like talking about those top 100 companies and really holding them accountable. That said, I do think that there is, we talk about the private sector as being very negative on climate change, which it is, but I think that there's also undue opportunity there. I mean, how can we focus on companies that are generating outsized capital that can be put into things that society doesn't usually promote, whether that's making green meat, whether that's making flying green, things like that. And I think democratizing access to investing in these private market companies will be really huge. And also getting women access to those venture capital dollars. How do we get women in positions where they're CEOs, they're steering the ESG for their company, they're running the big goals and the big decisions? I mean, if we have that, if we give women access to real capital, especially in the private market, then we can make real change. And especially about we were talking about getting these communities, how do we ask them about their issues and their problems, sharing the mic with them so that they're steering the ship for these companies? I think that'll be really critical.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was very inspirational. So I'm a firm believer that we have a lot of power in the grocery store with the choices that we make to buy. But sometimes I feel that I'm going to the library instead of the grocery store. And for example, with milk, we decided to buy oat milk instead of cow milk, just to be a bit more conscious. But then you realize that if you want to buy, for example, almond milk, it's just destroying California, apparently, with all these water issues. So do you guys have any advice on how to make good choices in the grocery store?
I would say to do what's most accessible for you and just kind of build on that. And I love what you said earlier. Progress over perfection is really important in the sustainability space, because even when it comes to grocery stores and food access, there are a lot of communities, even in the United States, that are struggling with something called food apartheid, that some people also call a food desert. So they don't even have, fresh produce or oat milk in their neighborhoods. Or even if we're thinking about indigenous communities and remote spaces of Alaska, they're having to pay $20 for a little thing of blueberries. So I know those are some extreme examples, but they're very real and sometimes happening just 20 minutes down the highway from us. So I would say really making the choices that are most accessible for you, and that's going to look different for different people. If you're able to, I think supporting local farmers and your farmers market is the best bet, because I love, strengthening local ecosystems. And know that nothing's going to be perfect, because even if you look at a chart of water usage for cow milk, oat milk, soy milk, rice milk, etc., that's just one metric. And then we're also looking at carbon, and that's going to vary for those different milk alternatives. So there's no perfect answer. And I think once you know that, just making the best choice that's right for you, building on that, tweaking it, and not, I think there's a lot of shame in the sustainability space. And I think as long as you are trying and you're doing something, and it sounds like you are, like that's not even on the top of people's mind. Like a lot of people, when they're going to the grocery store, they're like, what is this oat milk? I don't want this. So the fact that you're even thinking about it and asking about it seems like a step in the right direction.
Any other questions?
I feel like I should run over here. I'm sorry.
Oh, over here?
I have to hold on to it.
Okay. Thank you for speaking and for all the work you're doing. And I was wondering if you could comment on what healthy alliances look like between men and women and the environmental justice movement and climate movement in general.
Amazing question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that the environmental movement is so big that there's no way that just women could tackle it or just men could tackle it. So, I mean, just working together, being together, talking about these things, saying, hey, okay, even everyone being here today, men being here today, women being here today, and saying, okay, what communities are facing the largest threat from climate change? Who is marginalized? Whose voices aren't being heard? Who has privilege? And recognizing that in these discussions, I think that that's going to harness, all the kind of community and intersectionality we need together, is to really discuss that.
I think Phoebe said it perfectly. And I would add that, of course, the climate crisis is going to impact every single one of us. It's going to impact men. It's going to impact women. And really what we need is everyone, everywhere, needs to feel empowered to take action on the climate crisis. And I love what you said, because I think that for too long, we have led with a shame-based narrative. And I don't think that's right. I think we need to inspire people with hope, with optimism, and to realize when we do bring all the stakeholders to the table together, we are so much stronger and so much more able to affect change.
Oh, hi. So I have a quick question about the technology. So right now, we're living an interesting time where AI is accelerating super fast. Of course, things like ChatGPT, transformers, deep neural networks, et cetera. And all this relies on an insane amount of compute. So of course, there's been concerns in academia about climate, training these networks takes quite a bit of energy. And then also on top of that, if we want to use technology to do these things, we're probably going to rely on things like OpenAI, where they're the centralized power. We don't even know what's the data that's being used, the data that's being used to train the model. And so how do you fight that tension? You want to use the technology that's super powerful to do something great, but then you also kind of have to, rely on a centralized power. You don't really know what's going on there. You also have to spend quite a bit of compute to do it. A lot of people don't have access to the compute. So for example, I feel guilty sometimes just training neural networks every day, and I don't even know how to deal with it. So yeah.
I would say that when thinking about this, the big thing that I think of is that we need more investment in renewable energy. So that can be a way to kind of circumvent that the energy source is greener that is powering this tech. But then also recognizing that AI has the potential to expedite a lot of those solutions that we're looking at when it comes to climate. And I think it's important to counterbalance nature-based solutions, reforestation, things that, for example, Indigenous people have been talking about for centuries, as well as recognizing the power and potential of tech, of AI to expedite this transition, while realizing that, of course, issues like blockchain and issues like crypto, that is where I see a lot of negative implication. But like you said, I actually don't think there is enough research about how much power and compute power is being used to power AI, and whether or not that's offsetting the positive climate implications. So it will be very interesting to see more research done in that sector. But generally, I would say that it is very exciting and unclear time that we live in. So I do think that it is yet to be seen exactly what the long-term implications of that will be. But I know AI is already transforming the way that I look at education, and I'm equally excited to see what implications it has for climate.
Yeah, I'm also thinking as we have these big energy spends on training these new models, just like Sophia said, how do we make it on renewable energy? But number two, once we have these models, how do we use them to, also benefit the rest of the world? How do we use them to benefit the global south? I mean, whether that's accessing a doctor, whether that's accessing a prognostic with AI. How do we get the benefits of this technology to all societies instead of just America and here in the West? I think will be the real question, and how we leverage solutions from it to actually push forward this movement.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really inspirational. A question I had, I recently graduated, and my time at university, it's an inspiration to see how during such a personal time and a personal chapter, you are working so much on activism and creating your platform. So two things I was curious about. How do you balance that? Being a student and being at this, very exciting chapter in your life while working on a much larger platform. And furthermore, if, for students today, if they ever want to start creating a platform and break into activism, what could that look like as a student and beyond?
Well, looking at me and Phoebe, I mean, we have been working on creating our tech-driven sustainable fashion company out of our dorm rooms for this entire year, just in our free time. And I think that speaks to how passionate young people feel about this issue, that when you think about things you care about, you make time for them. And I think that speaks to how we've been able to balance everything, is really being driven by the passion to change the world. And secondly, I would also say something I love to really highlight is that every single person, every single major can be a climate major. You don't need to major in environmental science to care about climate or even to make a difference in climate. I look at my friends at Stanford. I have friends who are studying computer science and engineering. They can look at how to better model weather disasters. I look at my friends who are studying fashion. They can look at the intersection of sustainable textiles, or even my friends who are studying acting and theater. They're looking at how they can create more sustainable set designs. So every single person with whatever discipline really motivates you, whatever makes you passionate, there is a sustainability intersection, and there is that opportunity to push forward change. And I always love to say that to people, because it does make them feel empowered that every single one of us in some way or another has the potential to make an impact and push for climate action.
I love that so much. Question right here.
Hi. So I do like modeling and influencing on Instagram and stuff. How would you encourage other like high profile influencers to their followers to not like contribute to polluting by like buying fast fashion and like spreading awareness to the social causes? Like, what would be like a good way to encourage them to not contribute and like cause further damage?
As someone who uses Instagram to talk about climate, I think a really big elephant in the room for a lot of even sustainability content creators and influencers is they don't mention how much stuff they get for free. So even with sustainability influencers that are shaming people for not buying like $400 B Corp fair trade made from algae t-shirts, they're not honestly telling their community, like, I'm getting this for free. And even if people have over 10,000 followers or so, that sometimes puts you in that category. So I think a really important thing, like to be really transparent with your followers, is also showing them the amount of waste that you might get. Or if you do get something for free, making sure you're disclosing that. Because even in the sustainable fashion space, like I think sometimes people's followers feel bad, and we as content creators forget that privilege. So talking really transparently with your followers about it. And then I think also having different levels to it, like different levels. So talking about thrifting and repurposing, even doing stuff really casually. So even on your stories, if you're mending something, like maybe just try sewing something or taking a bag and turning it into washcloths. And you're doing it and you're not necessarily telling other people to do it, but you're just showing that that's a part of your life. And then I'm sure people will think that's really cool. Talking about thrifting and then also talking about brands that you really like. I love Reformation. It's one of my favorites. And I think doing it that way where you're not shaming people. And I think another thing for influencers who aren't sustainability people, it is so funny when your followers get to watch you like fumble through something. So if you're like, I'm just going to try to sew something today and it's kind of funny, or, oh my God, I'm going to go to an estate sale because I've never been to an estate sale and let me show you what it's like. That's one of my favorite TikTokers. She just goes to estate sales and I'm like, what is this? So I think just doing it organically and then also having polls in your stories, ask people, what's your favorite green beauty brand? What's your favorite green sunscreen, etc. Making it really optimistic and fun and funny is a way for people to engage.
Any last questions?
Thank you. Sorry. Okay. This question is not for me. I just joined in, so you might have already talked about this. This question is more for my youngest sister. She really loves finding things in the thrift store and all that kind of jazz. But with that being said, what you just said, I agree with all of it. Do you think it's also important to wear the things that you mess up as well? Because obviously not everybody has had the skill or the years to build on what they've had, even though they love it. And just to have the confidence to wear what is not perfected per se. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes. So something that we did at Intersectional Environmentalist when we first started is we, to fundraise, we're selling scrap t-shirts. So a scrap house is essentially the clothes that thrift stores don't want, and it just piles up. And we worked with a scrap house in Compton, and then we were screen printing our logo on those scrap tees that had holes in them, logos, different things like that, all to kind of educate our community that it doesn't need to be perfect, or if a seam is kind of like funny looking, it's totally okay. So yeah, I love that so much. If you make something and it's not perfect, that's kind of a part of its story. I remember when I tried to crochet for the first time, it was so bad, but I wore it and I was so proud of it. And I think that's kind of a part of the process.
I also think like when people approach sustainability, they often think that you have to be perfect because there is so much shame in the sustainability movement. So I think just like embracing the imperfectness of it all and just like letting your followers and your community learn with you, I think is really important too. Any other questions? Okay, I think we are ready to wrap it up. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our incredible panelists. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your Coachella weekend.
Woo! Thanks, guys.